The International Criminal Court, or the ICC, claims that Putin is involved in the abductions of children from Ukraine.
Putin has been one of the most terrifying leaders in the world. But do you really know about the worst thing he has done?
Russian President Vladimir Putin is guilty of war crimes.
This comes as Ukraine's president visits a town where he says there are bodies in the streets and mass graves.
This man poisons rivals, invades neighbors, and turns cities into graveyards, yet still smiles on the world stage. From mysterious disappearances to chilling war strategies, Vladimir Putin has done things no one could even imagine. And if you think you know what power looks like, think again. Here are 8 cruelest acts of Vladimir Putin. Number 8. The Second Chechnya War. Let's rewind to autumn of 1999. Russia had just gotten a new prime minister, a man who back then was still somewhat of a mystery to the public. This man was Vladimir Putin. However, what he did next left the entire region in shock. Putin launched a massive military operation overnight into Chechnya, supposedly to crush separatists. But here's where things start getting murky. See, this invasion wasn't just a strategic move. It came hot on the heels of a chilling wave of apartment bombings across several Russian cities. Hundreds were injured, and the bombings were instantly blamed on Chechen terrorists, with no trial and no real investigation, just a sweeping accusation. And Putin didn't hold back. He promised to wipe out the terrorists, even in the outhouse. Now, here's where things started spiraling. Russian forces hit Chechnya with relentless aerial strikes and artillery fire, and the capital city, Grozny, took the worst of it. Already battered from a previous war in the mid-90s, it was flattened all over again. By the early 2000s, observers were calling Grozny the most destroyed city on Earth, and that wasn't an exaggeration. While buildings were falling, thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire, unable to escape. They were trapped in rubble-filled neighborhoods littered with unexploded bombs, cut off from food, water, and any sense of safety. Russian troops, driven by this so-called anti-terrorist mission, started treating almost every Chechen male as a potential enemy. Human rights groups who dared to go in and investigate came back with horror stories of gross mistreatment and mass disappearances. Entire villages were subjected to violent cleanup operations, known as zakistka, where men were dragged away to filtration camps, and most never came back. But what about the Russian soldiers? Some of them didn't even try to hide what they were doing. One conscript reportedly told journalists, "We have to be cruel. Without no-limits warfare, we'll get nowhere in Chechnya." That mindset played out in real time, and in October of 1999, a missile strike hit Grozny's central market, unaliving over 100 people in a matter of seconds. Just 4 months later, in February of 2000, Russian police officers stormed the Novye Aldi suburb and ended the lives of at least 60 civilians, going door to door, looting homes, and ending people's lives. And here's the terrifying part. These weren't isolated incidents. Human rights organizations tried to count the fatalities, but even the lowest estimates were staggering. Tens of thousands of civilians were believed to have passed away. Some say the toll from both wars may have reached 300,000. When you think about it, that's possibly 5% of Chechnya's entire population. But wait till you hear about what really happened during the late 90s. Number 7. The Vision apartment bombings. So here's the scene. It's September of 1999, and life in Russia is already tense. But then, out of nowhere, terror strikes. One by one, in just 2 weeks, 4 massive explosions ripped through apartment buildings in different cities: Buynaksk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk. All of them happen late at night, when families are asleep, curled up in their beds, totally unaware of what's coming. The first blast hits on September 4th in Buynaksk, a city in Dagestan. A bomb goes off near an apartment complex where many Russian military families live. 62 people were slain, most of them women and children. Then on September 9th, Moscow is rocked by a deadly explosion. A 9-story building is reduced to rubble, unaliving 106 people. And it doesn't stop there. Just 4 days later, on September 13th, another building in Moscow is hit, this time on Kashirskoye Highway. 119 more lives are lost in an instant. And then, on September 16th, a truck bomb detonates outside an apartment in Volgodonsk, unaliving 17 more. In total, almost 300 innocent civilians are wiped out. Hundreds more are injured. And the scariest part is that these people aren't in war zones. They are literally in their homes, and that's what shakes the entire country to its core. Across Russia, people are terrified to go to sleep. Thousands of buildings are searched for explosives. Security is everywhere. And in the middle of this chaos, one man steps into the spotlight: Vladimir Putin. At the time, he's the newly appointed prime minister, not yet the dominant figure he'd soon become. But here's his moment. He vows to take down the terrorists responsible and declares a national day of mourning. People rally behind him, and just like that, he orders airstrikes on Chechnya, quickly followed by a full-on ground invasion. It's the start of the Second Chechnya War. The bombings gave him the perfect excuse, but here's where things take a darker, far more disturbing turn. As people grieved and war began, a different kind of suspicion started creeping in. Some began to wonder, what if the Chechen terrorists didn't do it? What if these attacks weren't what they seemed? And then came the incident that blew the lid off everything. On September 22nd, just days after the last bombing, residents in the city of Ryazan noticed something strange. Two men were spotted placing large sacks in the basement of an apartment building. Local police were called, and the bomb squad arrived. What they found was a live explosive device, and the timer was set for 5:30 in the morning. Another disaster had been narrowly avoided, but when the suspects were tracked down, that's when jaws really dropped, because they weren't Chechen terrorists. They were agents from Russia's own security service, the FSB. As the public demanded answers, Moscow scrambled to respond. Officials claimed it was just a trading exercise, and those sacks were filled with sugar, nothing dangerous at all. But let's be honest, who plants fake bombs in a residential basement without warning anyone? Most Russians didn't buy the explanation, and the Ryazan incident sparked something bigger. Independent lawmakers and journalists started asking questions, but the more they pushed, the more they were silenced. And not just with words. Sergei Yushchenkov, a member of the Russian parliament who launched an independent investigation, lost his life in 2003. Another investigator, journalist Yuri Shchekochikin, passed away that same year after suddenly falling ill. The symptoms matched poisoning. And then there was Mikhail Trepashkin, a former FSB officer who tried to go public with evidence that pointed to an inside job. He ended up in prison, accused of leaking state secrets, but he wasn't the only one who had been eliminated in this way. Number 6. The Mystery of Anna's End. There was a woman who had nerves of steel, a pen sharper than any sword, and a mission so dangerous it likely cost her life. Her name was Anna Politkovskaya. But what did she do? It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, October 7th, 2006. Anna had just come back from buying groceries, something completely routine. She stepped into the elevator of her apartment building in Moscow. But here's the thing, she never made it out. Someone was waiting for her there, and she was shot. The culprit left behind a Makarov pistol right there in the elevator, and just like that, one of Russia's most fearless investigative journalists was silenced forever. But this was not just any random crime. Anna was 48 years old and had spent years shining a harsh light on the darkest corners of Russia's war in Chechnya. Writing for the independent paper Novaya Gazeta, she exposed everything and didn't just blame anonymous soldiers. Instead, Anna pointed fingers at powerful men, including Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, who she publicly called a brutal, corrupt warlord. Now here's the chilling part. At the time of her passing, she was working on yet another explosive story about kidnappings and mistreatment linked to Kadyrov's regime. She knew it was risky, and this wasn't her first close call. She had already been threatened, detained by military forces, and even poisoned once. Back in 2004, she drank tea on a flight and suddenly fell violently ill, and no one ever gave a straight answer about what was really in that cup. But she kept going. She once wrote, "I have a duty to tell the truth." And she meant it. So when she was found unalived on President Putin's birthday, the symbolism hit hard. Many immediately suspected it wasn't a coincidence. Critics called it a message, a birthday gift to the boss. The Kremlin, as expected, stayed quiet for days. When Putin finally did respond, he called it a cruel crime, but then casually added that Anna's influence on political life in Russia was minimal. No high-ranking official came to her funeral, and to those who knew her, that silence spoke louder than words. Anna's assassination sent a wave of fear through what remained of Russia's independent media. And sadly, this wasn't new. She was the 13th journalist to be unalived in a contract-style hit since Putin came to power in 2000. But this one hit differently because this was someone who had risked everything to report from war zones and prison cells. And now she was gone. The investigation dragged on for years. Finally, in 2014, 8 years after her passing, 5 men were convicted. 4 of them were Chechen natives, and the 5th was a former Moscow police officer. The alleged gunman, Rustam Makhmudov, was sentenced along with his accomplices. Authorities claimed that a Chechen mobster named Lom Ali Gaitukayev had arranged the hit for money, using relatives and that rogue cop to pull it off. But here's the one question that still haunts this case. Who actually ordered the hit? In Russian, the term is zakazchik, the mastermind who gives the order. And in Anna's case, that person has never been found. Even the lead prosecutor admitted the real organizer was still out there. Novaya Gazeta and Anna's family lawyer believed this was no random act. They insisted the act was orchestrated from high up, not just by a gang for hire. All signs, they argued, pointed to someone with serious power and something serious to hide, almost exactly like the next horrifying poisoning case. Number 5. The poisoning. A man named Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian intelligence officer, was living in exile in the UK. He wasn't just another defector. This guy had a lot to say about the Kremlin, and he was not afraid to talk. Since fleeing Russia in 2000, Litvinenko had been calling out President Putin publicly, accusing him of everything from covering up atrocities to staging the 1999 apartment bombings. He even claimed Putin had ties to organized crime. Then came November 1st, and things began to shift. Litvinenko met with 2 familiar faces, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, both ex-security operatives from Russia. The 3 of them sat down for a quiet chat at London's Millennium Hotel. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just some green tea, or so it seemed. But what Litvinenko didn't know was that the teapot had been spiked with polonium-210, a radioactive substance so rare and lethal that only a government could realistically get its hands on it. Within hours, he started feeling sick. And not the usual kind of sick. This was different because he was violently ill. To make matters worse, doctors couldn't figure out what was happening. His organs began shutting down, one after the other, and nothing made sense. Then, Litvinenko himself brought up a theory. Maybe it's the FSB. That's when doctors decided to test for radiation. And when the results came back, everyone's worst fear was confirmed. It was polonium-210, but by that point, it was already too late. Litvinenko hung on for 3 agonizing weeks. His hair fell out, skin turned pale, and his body wasted away. But during that time, he did something that would change everything. He pointed the finger. From his deathbed, he accused Vladimir Putin directly of ordering his fate. It was a final act of defiance, and on November 23rd, he passed away, officially becoming the first person in history confirmed to have been poisoned with a radioactive isotope. The public outrage in Britain was immediate and massive, and investigators launched a deep dive into what happened. The more they uncovered, the worse it got. Turns out, the 2 assassins had left behind a radioactive breadcrumb trail, and traces of polonium-210 were found everywhere. The hotel room, the teapot, restaurants, cars, and even airplane seats. It was like a glowing fingerprint pointing back to them. In 2007, the UK formally charged Lugovoy and Kovtun with the crime, but Russia refused to extradite them. In fact, Putin did the opposite of cooperating. He awarded Lugovoy a medal and gave him a seat in the Russian parliament. Still, the investigation didn't stop. A full public inquiry began in Britain in 2015, led by Sir Robert Owen, and the final report was absolutely damning. It concluded that the operation to unalive Litvinenko was most likely approved by both the head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, and President Putin himself. In other words, this wasn't a rogue hit, it was a state-sponsored crime, executed on foreign soil. However, there are very few people in the world that Putin wouldn't get rid of within seconds, and the next case is proof of that. Number 4. The end of an opposition leader. Boris Nemtsov, once a rising political star and former deputy prime minister during the Yeltsin era, was no stranger to power. Back in the 1990s, he was the fresh-faced reformist many thought could be Russia's future. But by 2015, things had changed. He was no longer in the Kremlin, he was outside it, and he had become one of President Putin's loudest and most persistent critics. He wasn't just tweeting from the sidelines either. Nemtsov was out in the streets, leading protests against Putin's war in Ukraine, calling out government corruption, and preparing a damning report on Russia's military involvement in the Donbass. He even went on the radio the very day he passed away, urging people to join a peace march. That night, as he walked across the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge with his girlfriend, a car pulled up behind them. A man jumped out, took Nemtsov's life in the back, and vanished into the night. It was that fast. And here's the part that will really baffle you. Nemtsov collapsed and passed away in full view of the Kremlin's security cameras. You would think that kind of surveillance, in one of the most heavily guarded spots in all of Russia, would catch everything. But somehow, no one saw a thing. The public reaction was utter outrage, and tens of thousands of people poured into the streets for his memorial march, many holding signs asking the same question: who ordered this crime? Within weeks, the Kremlin claimed it was getting to the bottom of things. Several suspects were arrested, all Chechen men. And 2 years later, in 2017, a military court in Moscow convicted 5 of them. The alleged gunman, Zaur Dadayev, was a former officer in Chechnya's interior ministry. Prosecutors said he and his accomplices had stalked Nemtsov and carried out the hit for a bounty of 15 million rubles, roughly $250,000. Now, here's where it starts getting suspicious. Dadayev first confessed, saying he was angry about Nemtsov's support for the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. But then he changed his story and claimed he was forced into confessing. Either way, the jury found him guilty. He got 20 years in prison, and the others got sentences ranging from 11 to 19 years. But that wasn't enough for Nemtsov's family and supporters. To them, it felt like a cover-up. Even the judge's final verdict acknowledged that there were still unidentified persons who instructed the men. In other words, the people who ordered the hit were still out there. And then came the Kadyrov connection, which changed everything. You see, the convicted suspects weren't just random guys from Chechnya. They had ties to Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader handpicked by Putin himself. And here's the wild part. Right after Dadayev was arrested, Kadyrov praised him, called him a true patriot. Authorities named a missing 6th man, Ruslan Mukudanov, as an organizer who had fled abroad. But again, there was no real effort to go higher up the chain. Nemtsov's family lawyer said it bluntly. They were not prepared to look into the entourage of Kadyrov. And that's what people still believe, that someone in Kadyrov's inner circle, or maybe Kadyrov himself, ordered the hit to eliminate a vocal critic. Now what happens when his crimes aren't that discreet? You'll find out. Number 3. The war crimes. One of Vladimir Putin's most devastating foreign interventions started in September 2015, when Russia officially joined the Syrian civil war. But this wasn't just some symbolic move or a cautious show of support. Putin went all in. His mission was to keep Bashar al-Assad in power, no matter the human cost. Now publicly, Russia claimed it was there to fight ISIS, and that was the line. But almost immediately, their bombs started falling not on ISIS strongholds, but on Assad's opposition groups, the very rebels who were trying to break free from decades of authoritarian rule, And that's when things took a horrifying turn. By late 2016, the cruelty of Russia's campaign reached its peak during the infamous siege of Aleppo. Eastern Aleppo, held by opposition forces, was turned into a death trap. Russian warplanes, working side by side with Syrian government troops, launched an unrelenting bombing campaign on the city, day after day, week after week. It wasn't just targeted strikes either. We're talking thousands of bombs, missiles, and banned munitions dropped into densely populated urban neighborhoods. What happened next was heartbreaking. In just 1 month, between September and October of that year, at least 446 civilians were caught in the crossfire, and more than 90 of them were children. Entire families were wiped out as apartment buildings crumbled into piles of rubble. People passed away while baking bread, and others were hid in the market while buying food to survive the siege. And then came the hospitals. One by one, Aleppo's medical facilities were hit. Amnesty International and other humanitarian organizations documented at least 6 deliberate airstrikes on hospitals across Aleppo province between late 2015 and early 2016. And these weren't surface-level attacks. These were bunker-busting bombs meant to take out underground shelters, places where doctors and patients were trying to survive. In one particularly horrific case, in October 2016, an underground hospital was obliterated. Patients and staff inside were unalived instantly, and sadly, it didn't stop there. Cluster bombs and incendiary weapons were also dropped on civilian zones. Ola Solvang from Human Rights Watch put it bluntly, unleashing this kind of firepower in a packed urban setting was guaranteed to harm civilians, and it did. He called for those responsible to be tried for war crimes because what happened wasn't random. It was a tactic, one designed to make life unbearable, to break the will of civilians and force opposition fighters to surrender. It was siege and slaughter, and it worked. But Aleppo wasn't the only place that burned. In early 2016, Russian airstrikes destroyed a Doctors Without Borders supported hospital in Maret al-Numan, in Idlib province. Medical staff lost their lives, and a few months later, a United Nations humanitarian convoy near Aleppo was bombed. Investigators concluded that Syrian and likely Russian aircraft were responsible, and each time, the Kremlin denied involvement. Sometimes they claimed it was fake. Other times, they just said nothing. But independent investigators were already piecing it together. In 2019, a detailed analysis by the New York Times matched Russian pilot radio chatter with the timing of bombings on civilian hospitals. In other words, there was no doubt left. This was real, it was organized, and it was intentional. By helping Assad destroy rebel-held cities using sheer force, Putin's forces directly contributed to the deaths of thousands and the displacement of millions. Western leaders called it a war crime. France's foreign minister compared the bombing of Aleppo to Guernica, a reference to one of the most infamous civilian bombings in modern history. The United Nations said it could amount to crimes against humanity. But guess what? Every time the international community tried to pass resolutions, Russia vetoed them at the United Nations Security Council. That shielded both Assad and the Kremlin from facing any real accountability. And like clockwork, that's exactly what happened at the time of Navalny, as you're about to see. Number 2. The chaos of the Navalny case. It started in August of 2020, when Alexei Navalny boarded a flight from Tomsk, Siberia, heading back to Moscow. But in mid-air, something went terribly wrong. He collapsed. Passengers watched in horror as he writhed in pain, gasping, drenched in sweat. The pilot made an emergency landing in Omsk, and doctors scrambled to figure out what was happening. But no one had answers. At least, not at first. Then, under intense international pressure, Navalny was airlifted out of Russia, still in a coma, and flown to Germany. And that's when the truth began to unravel. German labs revealed that Navalny had been poisoned with Novichok, a deadly nerve agent developed during the Soviet era. The same substance had been used 2 years earlier in an attempted hit in the UK against former spy Sergei Skripal. This wasn't some random poison. Novichok is tightly controlled, and if someone uses it, it's almost always a state-sponsored hit. So who did it? Investigative journalists from Bellingcat and other outlets started digging, and what they found was shocking. They uncovered phone and travel records that showed a secret FSB chemical weapons team had been trailing Navalny on more than 30 trips since 2017. Not just once or twice, over 30 times. And guess what? That same team was in Tomsk the day Navalny was poisoned. But here's where it gets even more unbelievable. After waking up from his coma, Navalny didn't just recover. He turned the tables and actually managed to call one of the agents who had followed him. He then tricked him into confessing. Over the phone, the FSB agent casually explained how they had smeared the poison onto Navalny's underwear. It was unbelievable. The case was proved to be an FSB operation and likely approved at the highest level. Still, even after everything he'd been through, Navalny wasn't done. In January of 2021, knowing exactly what he was walking into, he boarded a flight back to Moscow. Cameras were rolling and supporters were cheering. But as soon as the plane landed at Sheremetyevo Airport, he was arrested on the spot. That marked the start of a new chapter: prison. The charge stemmed from violating parole from a previous suspended sentence. The absurd part was that he was being accused of failing to report to authorities while he was in a coma, recovering from a poisoning attempt. In February, a judge converted his suspended sentence into real time, 2 years and 8 months behind bars. Navalny called it what it was: a sham, a way to jail one man in hopes of silencing millions. He was sent to a penal colony known for its brutal conditions. But he didn't stop speaking out. Even from behind bars, Navalny's anti-corruption foundation kept working. They released the now famous Putin's Palace investigation, exposing alleged corruption at the highest levels. The Kremlin hit back hard, and the foundation was declared extremist and banned. Navalny's allies were arrested or forced into exile, his lawyers were harassed, and Navalny himself was placed in solitary confinement again and again. In August, he was handed another 19 years. Unless something changes, that means he could spend the rest of his life in prison, all because he refused to stop challenging Putin. Still, none of his actions have been as disastrous as the last one on this list. Number 1. The invasion of Ukraine. This story begins in early 2014. Ukraine had just ousted its pro-Russian president after mass protests, and Putin didn't take that lightly. Almost immediately, he made his move. Russian forces, masked and unmarked, slipped into Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. It was a sneak operation that ended with Russia annexing Crimea in March, an act condemned worldwide as illegal. But that was just the beginning. While the world was still reacting to Crimea, Putin lit a fire in eastern Ukraine. He fueled a separatist uprising in the Donbas region, not just with words, but with weapons, fighters, and support from Russian intelligence. By summer, the region was a battlefield. Then came a moment that stunned the world. On July 17th, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, a civilian passenger plane, was shot down over Donbas. All 298 people on board passed away, most of them Dutch, Malaysian, and Australian civilians. Investigations found the weapon used was a Russian-made Buk missile system, smuggled in from Russia and fired from rebel-held territory. In 2022, a Dutch court convicted 3 men tied to Russian intelligence and the separatist forces. The missile had come straight from a Russian army base. Even more chilling was the fact that investigators found strong signs that the decision to supply that missile came from the top, possibly even Putin himself. Still, Russia denied everything. Fast forward to February 24th, 2022. Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces rolled in from the north, south, and east, and their aim was to topple Ukraine's government and take control. But this wasn't just a military campaign. It became something darker, something designed to crush not just armies, but people. Cities were bombarded relentlessly. Kharkiv, Mariupol, Bucha, and dozens more came under attack. Civilians died in their homes, in shelters, and on the streets. Schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings became targets. The world watched in real time as cities turned to rubble. It looked terrifyingly similar to Grozny and Aleppo, only this time it was in the heart of Europe. By mid-2023, the United Nations had confirmed over 9,000 civilian casualties, including more than 500 children, but they warned the real number is almost certainly far higher. In retaken cities like Izium and Kherson, investigators found dungeons and mass graves. Families are still trying to find out what happened to their loved ones. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.